academic advancement activity of GPS STEM, and this is in collaboration with UCI Mine. Today's focus is going to be on F99 and K00. I want to give it to Dr. David Fruman, who you might know. Dr. Fruman is the academic director of GPS STEM program, and we recently ran a fellowship success workshop piloted last year, and that has become a full course now. I think if you are not aware about some of the fellowship academic advancement activities GPS STEM offers, tune in and keep an eye on that. And with that, I'll give it to David.
Thank you. Yes, so we started the academic advancement activities when GPS STEM took over from GPS Biomed, and our primary goal has been to really to stimulate the application for more NIH fellowships, first with the F31s, F32s, et cetera, and now with the F99 K00s. So I'm pleased to see that Josh Grill and Mitchell Farrell, today's speakers, are taking the initiative to present this workshop on the F99 K00. I first heard about this mechanism when the National Cancer Institute developed this, and I thought it was a great idea because for graduate students, if you're beyond year 3 or the beginning of year 4, you're no longer such a great candidate for an F31, which is a training award. But these are designed for students who are nearing the last year or 2 of their thesis work and thinking about a postdoc and what do they want to do in this transitional period. And they're similar to the senior postdoc early faculty awards, which have the number K99R00. So they just use a similar type of nomenclature. And these have been very successful and popular in the cancer research community. And it's great to see them expanded into neuroscience and other disciplines. So as Surinder mentioned, we have a course on fellowship writing. Some of you may have signed up for it and you want to audit the course, let me know. You can email me, I can add you as an additional student or postdoc. So with that, I will hand it over. Our first speaker will actually be Mitch Farrell, who is a recipient of a DSPAN award.
Yeah, thank you again for coming today, everybody. So I'm going to introduce the DSPAN award, also known as the F99 K00, and some general lessons learned over the course of applying for and fortunately receiving this award. So I'm going to start out with a brief timeline. Jump into the difference between an F31 and the F99 K00 and sort of at what point of the grad school trajectory you might be applying for one or the other. Talking about the difference between the F99 portion and then the K00 portion of the award. Talk about some of the reviewer comments, what reviewers liked, what reviewers disliked about my particular application. And then just some overall advice that I would recommend, given I've gone through the F31 and the F99 process, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Josh Grill, and he's served on a study section for F99 K00, so he is sort of an inside scoop that I'm not exactly privy to. So. Just a general timeline. So I'm currently a 5th year grad student in neurobiology and behavior. And in terms of my overall timeline, so I started grad school in fall of 2016. So just talking about the sort of grants and how I've been involved in the NIH system overall. So first I applied for unsuccessfully the NSF GRFP in fall 2017. And then at the end of my 2nd year, I shifted on to a T32 traineeship funded by the NINDS. So that was at the end of my 2nd year. And while on the T32, I ended up applying for the F31 NRSA at the end of my 2nd year. And then mid last year, so this is mid 4th year, I ended up applying for the F99 K00 and was fortunate to have been funded for this award in last September. So just the general difference between an F31 versus an F99 K00, I think this is sort of an important distinction to make, because if you're very early on in grad school career, it might be worth considering applying for an F31 and then later on applying for an F99 K00. So an F31 is a predoctoral fellowship, or sorry, a predoctoral grant only, whereas an F99 K00 is a joint predoc and postdoc award. So an F31 provides 2 to 3 years of postdoctoral funding, and the advantage here is that you can apply earlier on in your grad school career, so in years 2 to 3. And it is a very good practice for ultimately applying for an F99 K00. Especially given the RFA, the request for applications is generally similar between the F31 and the F99 K00. And Dr. Grill will be jumping into this a little bit more detail in a bit. And the F99 K00, as opposed to the F31, provides 1 to 2 years of predoctoral funding, and then an additional 4 years of postdoctoral funding. So if you are planning to do a postdoc after you graduate, it's a really wonderful opportunity to facilitate a transition to a postdoctoral fellowship. And this award you can apply for later on in graduate school. So this is years 3 to 4. So you must be post-advancement, sort of beginning to wrap things up. And one of the fundamental differences between the F31 and the F99, beyond the funding period, is the research strategy is quite different. So this is one of the main research component of the grant. And what this entails is 3 different aims. So this is what you've done in graduate school so far, what you plan to do in the sort of the remainder of your grad school career, and then your proposed postdoctoral research direction. So I'm going to jump into each of these and describe what these are representing here. So as I mentioned, research strategy is the main research component of the grant, and Dr. Groh will be jumping into the other components that are involved in this grant mechanism in a bit. But A1, what you've done so far. So whereas the F31 is more geared towards, okay, I have this preliminary data, this is what I plan to do with the rest of my grad school career. For the F99 portion, this is essentially completed or published experiments. So for example, I referenced all completed experiments in my AIM-1 and essentially used figures from those papers that I had published. So this is all basically what I have done so far. And then AIM-2, this is going to be what you plan to do in the remaining 1 to 2 years in grad school. So for this, you want to provide some reasonable amount of preliminary data and give a reasonable timeline for completing these experiments. So in my case, and I think it's generally a good idea, is proposing to learn a new technical skill in addition to other sorts of training that you'll be receiving during the F99 portion. And just a note here is that you want to be careful not to propose too much. So whereas with the F31, you have 2 to 3 years of funding for this award, and then for that award, but for this award, it's only 1 to 2 years. So it's easy to propose a bit too much that you might not be able to complete, especially since you have to write an additional grant, this is the K00, on top of the F99. Yeah, and anybody have any questions, please feel free to interrupt it at any time. But we will have time for Q&A after I wrap up here. So for the K00 phase, so this is the AIM-3 of your research strategy. So this is your proposed postdoctoral research direction. And I say here, know your skill set. So I think that's the sort of the crux of this part of the grant is think deeply about your skill set and mention how you will address gaps in your skill set during your postdoctoral training. So for example, in grad school, I gained expertise in behavior, in rat behavior and neural circuit manipulations. And moving on to a postdoctoral fellowship, I'm interested in seeking training in imaging or in vivo electrophysiology during a postdoc. So sort of recognizing what I'm good at, recognizing what I would dovetail nicely with my skill set, and ultimately outlining how this combined training will lead to an independent research position. Yeah, so this is essentially what I just mentioned. So it's not necessary to know who your postdoc advisor is. So for example, you are looking into the future 1 to 2 years. So you might not have an advisor lined up just yet, but I think as Dr. Grill will talk about a little bit, it might be helpful to have, for example, a letter from somebody you plan to be working for. So though I was successful in being funded for this grant, without having a postdoctoral advisor lined up, it might be helpful, and it might look good for study section. So writing the K00, so this is separate from the initial application, but this is after you've been on the F99 funding for 1 to 2 years. You have to write another grant with the postdoctoral mentor, and this just entails entails writing another grant, and ensures sort of a solid transition from pre-doc to postdoc. And then in terms of my specific grant, so I just looked through the reviewer comments and seeing what they liked about my application, what they didn't like about my application. So I'm going to start off with a few strengths that they noticed, that they noted here. So one is that given that my advisor is relatively junior, they like the inclusion of a co-mentor. So I'm actually my PI's first graduate student, so the inclusion of a co-mentor in this sort of situation I think is necessary. So we contacted the chair of the department and asked for a letter of support for the grant. And they said that was a good strength, the sort of dual training team of somebody who's more junior and then somebody who's more established. So another thing is general productivity, papers, conference abstracts, these sorts of things will look really good for this sort of application. So they also mentioned the proposed studies follow logical progression, both scientifically and training wise. So essentially the skills are building upon each other. So this gets back to the point of addressing your skill set, knowing what your skill set is, and then addressing those gaps in the F99 and the K00 portion. And then also I'm in the addiction field specifically. So looking, so they really liked UCI's focus on addiction research. But of course, UCI is also known for many other types of research. So yeah, I think they generally like UCI as a whole. So that's a good thing. A couple of weaknesses that they did note were there was little discussion of soft skills. So things like networking, interviewing, exploration of alternate careers, training for running a lab. So I didn't mention too much of this in the training plan. So I focused more on technical skills, and a few of the reviewers noted that focus on some of these more soft skills will be important for transitioning to an independent career. And they also mentioned that the career goals are broadly described. So I just said, finding a mentor in sort of broad terms. So I think this is getting to the point of, perhaps including a letter from somebody who will be your postdoctoral mentor could be good for laying out the training trajectory. And yeah, the same applies here. So the professional development during the K00 phase was not as fleshed out as the F99 phase. So just a couple of things to note here. So overall, general advice. So you want to start early when applying for this, right? So definitely read the RFA, which is essentially the instructions, the specific components of the grant. Contact letter writers, co-mentors, same for any other grant that you'll be applying for. And I think in my experience, the best practice for applying for the F99 K00 was applying for the NSF GRFP and especially the F31. So this sort of familiarizes you with the NIH system. And it's also, there's quite a bit of overlap between an F31 and an F99. So it's really wonderful practice. Applying for the F31. Also, definitely read successful applications. So looking at previously funded F31s, previously funded F99 K00s. And in my experience, DSPAN fellows are willing to help. So for example, one of Marcella Wood's previous students received an F99 K00. So I contacted him. And he sent me his application, and that really helped me formulate what they're specifically looking for these sort of grants. So another thing sort of goes without saying is including many drafts of your each of your documents, especially, you know, the sort of more difficult ones, the research strategy especially. I went through, you know, many drafts of this. And then another thing that will help sort of ease the logistical stress, in my experience, is contact your department's grant specialist early. So this will, you know, ensure that you are on the right track, and you're not, you know, going down paths that that you shouldn't be going down, essentially. And they'll give you a nice, you know, a nice list of things that you can do for the grant in preparation, and, you know, timelines and these sorts of things. So yeah, absolutely. Feel free to email me. So that's right here. And then I will turn it over to Dr. Josh Grill, who will discuss the reviewer's perspective.
So Mitchell, that was great. And congratulations on your grant. Based on my experiences on a study section, it's quite an achievement to get one of these. We had many, many grants in our study section on this particular mechanism, which I was not aware of until I was asked to review them. So I really had to sort of learn the mechanism a little bit, and I really leaned heavily on the RFA as a reviewer for this particular study section, and I'll do so for my presentation here as well. The only other sort of top line statement I want to make is that in preparing for this study section and in doing this study section, I really arrived at a place where I view the F99 K00 as a major investment by the Institute in the applicant. And in fact, in the RFA for NIA, I should have begun by saying, for those who I have not met before, I'm an Alzheimer's researcher here on campus. I'm in neurobiology and behavior, as well as psychiatry in the School of Medicine side, and I'm part of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. So I was invited to this panel specifically for NIA, and the title Transition to Aging Research makes sense given that. I really viewed this as an investment, and one of the things that was key in me arriving in that conclusion is that the RFA for the NIA F99 K00 specifically calls out that one of the things you should include in your grant is a future goal of submitting a K99 R00 grant at the end of your training period. And I have long held the view that the K99 R00 mechanism is a major investment by NIH and individuals. So this is just one step earlier in the path. And I think that it's a tremendous opportunity to sort of get in the club and get that track record going of being an NIH funded investigator who is on a path to independence and becoming a major contributor to whatever your field happens to be. So I think these are fantastic opportunities, and everyone who's in the right career stage should think about applying. So I'm just going to kind of briefly walk through the RFA, and more importantly, my observations and experiences from sitting on a 2-day virtual study panel, study section related to the NIA version of this. You know, so the RFA outlines the length of funding you can request and specifies how it should be divided. I'll come back to this throughout my talk, but I saw really widely varying balances of expenditure of years between the F99 and K00. And what's most important, I think, and I'll say this again, is that you have a rational balance for how you're going to spend that time and how you spend the words and space of your grant. So I'll just say right up front, if you are going to have 5 years of your support in the K00 part, don't spend all your grant talking about your grad school work and proposing work there. It really has to make sense. It has to have a balance. So you're gonna have specific things that you have to outline in your grant that the RFA will define for your particular institute. Pay really close attention to those things. If you don't do what the RFA mandates you do, you're really at risk for not being discussed. And we did have several grants that were not discussed in my study section. Again, this was a relatively long 2-day panel, a lot of reviewers. People are busy. People have a lot of other things on their plate. I know I was racing to get through all of these applications because I had another study section the same month with 1,000-page grants that were waiting for me. So, you have to make it easy for people to check the boxes, to be excited about your application, to get excited quickly about your application, meaning the first things that they read, which are typically going to be we are often sent the summaries, the abstracts in advance, in part to try to exclude ourselves for conflicts. So don't think that no one reads that. They sometimes read that first before they have access to the rest of the grant. And then you've probably been told by your advisors to spend disproportionate amounts of time on your specific aims. That is true. It's still true in this mechanism. But the other thing that is key is your personal statement, and you're telling your story about your own research trajectory, because really this is an investment in you as an individual, even more so than the science you propose, although no scientific grant can ever get funded if it doesn't have good science in it. So all the parts matter, all the checkboxes matter, and all the reviewers are going back to the RFA. I was going back to the RFA many times as I worked through these grants, in particular because of the wording of some of the sections that I had to score, and reminding myself of what the difference between those things were. So really pay very careful attention, and I'll come back to some of the things on here as well. So the specific aims for NIA, they specifically say you should have 2 specific aims, one to describe your F99 work and one to describe your K00 work. Both are important. As Mitchell outlined, you may not yet know where you're going to go for your K00, but you still have to have a sense of what kind of work you're going to plan to do. And, this is not a contract. You won't be held to doing that if you get funded and something changes as you go through your F99. But there should be a logic to the science you're proposing. It should build, and it should build your skill set. And so there has to be scientific alignment and training alignment, right? So I think Mitchell's example is a fantastic one. He's been doing behavior work in the space of addiction, and he proposed to move into electrophys. So I'm sure his grant said that he's going to go out and find a mentor who's a well-funded investigator who does electrophys in their lab. And it wouldn't have made sense if he had another behavioral person identified to be his mentor, but then proposed electrophys in the K00 phase of his grant. So there needs to be a logic, a rationale for everything you're doing. And even if you're not 100% sure what that K00 phase is going to hold for you, you really want to have it be something that the reviewers can get excited about and see a logic as to where you are and what you've been doing, and how this is going to take you one step closer to having your own lab that can combine techniques and build. One of the grants I reviewed did not get discussed because there were many reasons, but one of them was that the the K00 phase was more or less the same type of science as the F99. Slight variation, but really not learning a new research technique or skill set at all in that separate phase. And it really was, pardon the phrase, dead on arrival. It never had a shot because it was not, you couldn't support the training component of it. So the strongest applications are going to have really clear logical alignment between the phases, with very strong mentorship, which I'll come back to. So when you're scoring these things, you have to evaluate the applicant, their mentors, and other relevant personnel, the research training plan, the training potential, and the overlap between those two things is what kept me going back to the RFA to outline for myself exactly what comment belonged where. And then lastly, the institutional environment and commitment to training. So you're scoring each of those things with the traditional NIH scoring for these grants of 1 to 9, 1 being the strongest possible. Overall, I would say the most important thing is you, the applicant. Again, this represents the reviewers making a recommendation to the National Institutes of Health of whether they should invest in you as a career scientist who will be seeking research funding dollars from NIH for the remainder of your years. So you have to sell yourself. This is not a time to be modest. You really need to make it easy for reviewers to be excited about you, be excited about the work you're going to do in your career, defend you if someone else feels differently, and you need to give them a lot of ammo. You're hoping that the reviewers who closely go through your application are very excited about what you will bring to the field and give them a lot of opportunity to tout you. There was one in our study section, a young person had 45 publications. Take credit for everything you've done. By the way, that person didn't get as high a marks as you might expect because they were a grad student who hadn't published a paper yet in their grad career. All those publications came as an undergrad and a post-bac working in a highly productive lab. It was very impressive to have that many pubs at that career stage. But reviewers said, but they don't have any pubs in the lab they're working in right now. And so it really has to be a complete whole story. This idea that your grant should only deal with your graduate career, I think is wrong. Some of the strongest applications I read really told their whole story. Why did they get into research in the first place? What was their earliest research experiences? This really helps reviewers feel like they know you, and you want them to feel like they know you. Again, you're trying to convince them that you are worth investment. And the more they know about you, I think the more that they are likely to do that. So this is in some ways a true personal statement. Why are you so inspired by research? How long have you been committed? Make them understand that you are a researcher who's never going to change their mind about their career. You're in it for the science, and this is what you want to do, and you're going to keep doing it. I'm open-minded to the idea that we train people who aren't going to be scientists or are going to do other careers. Please know that. But if you're applying for this grant, you need to convince people that you are on a path to being an independent researcher someday. So the absolute strongest applicants were those who had a clear passion and commitment to research. And for me, this was, aging research in particular. They had to have productivity, and you couldn't have 0 papers. It wasn't a DOA to have 0 papers, but if you're not productive, you're not as strong as someone who is. So if you're close to getting a couple pubs, get them out perhaps before you put this thing in. And then others can tell your story as well as you can. And if you don't have strong letters, it's a limitation, and it can hurt your score. So choose carefully who you're asking to write your letters. And Mitchell, you'll tell me if it was different for you, but for the ones I reviewed, your primary mentor and even your K00 mentor didn't have letters. There was a statement that was kind of the last piece of the grant. So the letters of support were more like character references coming from other people outside of your main application. And so, who was your undergraduate research mentor? Who else have you worked with in other capacity that can speak to these core tenets that you want reviewers to understand you have, making you a strong F99 K00 applicant. So, someone who can speak to your commitment to being a researcher, someone who can speak to your passion about the topic, someone who can speak to the great potential you hold as an independent thinker who's going to come up with novel ideas, and help advance your field. All of these things are really key, and all of them are going to be top of mind for reviewers when they're scoring and then discussing your application. I would say the second most important thing is your mentors. And this includes your F99 mentor and your K00 mentor. And if you don't have a K00 mentor identified, Mitchell has already told us and shown us that that is not a deal breaker. You can still get funded without having a K00 mentor identified. At the end, I'll put up a graphic that I kind of came up with through the process of serving as a panel member. But I do think that if you don't know who your K00 mentor is, that is fine, but you really need a plan. And it is something you want to talk to a lot of people about. And I think sharing drafts is a really important recommendation that Mitchell made. But you want people to say, this person has really given a lot of thought to the type of mentor they will need, the skill set that they will need, how they're going to go about finding that person, and securing a postdoctoral position in a lab that fits a particular phenotype. So you really have to show that you've put thought into that. And again, I saw some otherwise strong grants do not well at all because there was just no attention paid to the K00 phase. Obviously, where you are in your relative career matters a lot. If you are proposing 1 year of F99 and you don't have a K00 mentor identified, that's a bigger weakness than if you're proposing 4 years of F99 and don't have a K00 mentor identified. So balance is always key. Definitely saw people, the strongest app proposals, I think, are where both phase mentors have been identified. I definitely saw proposals that suffered because one or both mentors didn't have adequate funding. So you really want someone who's got current NIH dollars. We definitely see study sections play this game where they say, well, the mentor's grant is going to run out next year. What are they going to do then? You know, I hate that this is part of your responsibility when you're writing these grants, but this is the reality. If you don't have mentors who are well funded, then, you know, a co-mentor might be a good idea. Ideally, someone who has several NIH grants, because these are the things that reviewers will look at. The statements at the end of the grant do really need to communicate commitment to you, the applicant. And reviewers will read between the lines. There was certainly a handful of grants I saw where the K00 mentor was identified, but the statement was less than strong. You know, things that said like, yes, when you graduate, we will be happy to consider you for a position in our lab. You know, reviewers often read that out loud during the panel and said, I don't know if they're going to take them. It's just not a strong commitment. And again, you may be in a limited position to ask people to what to say in that regard, but I think you are in a good position when you first are talking about the grant to say, you know, do you feel like you could write me a strong letter or a strong statement to go with this application where, you know, you say you're going to take me no matter what, or that, you know, this makes sense, and you have every reason to expect that this will be a natural partnership that we could have where I could enter your lab, et cetera. The strongest ones were, you know, very telling that they had already met the applicant, that they knew the applicant and the work they're doing now, and that they're excited about the person joining the lab because they're going to bring something themselves, and that they will have the opportunity to learn the robust techniques and infrastructure of that lab when they come there. And again, you know, you don't want to leave one lab and go to a lab doing the exact same thing. That was a thing that really hurt some folks. And I would argue that the easiest way to have complementary is also to change institutions. So, you know, one of the ones I had a mentorship team. The person was going to stay at the same institution for both phases, but they were going to change the mentor but they were both members of the same mentorship team, and they'd have one primary mentor for the F99 and another primary mentor for the K00. To me, that's kind of a tough sell. You have to really make a case that you're going to get very different types of training and skills from those two different phases when you have access to the same people throughout the whole course of the grant. That's a difficult thing to really sell to reviewers. So the best case scenario is you've got, just like Mitch said, you're going to learn a totally different skill set, probably in a different lab at a different institution. Can you make it work at the same institution? Yes, but I think you really have to emphasize that it's essentially the same as going somewhere else, because you're going to be on a different side of campus or part of a different group. Or, if you were going in ours, you didn't have to be an aging researcher in F99, but you had to propose you would be doing aging research in the K00. So if you're not an aging researcher as a grad student, but then you're going to go into an aging lab at the same institution, you might be able to make that sell, even though I think it's still difficult. So then the training plan is obviously really important. This is more or less about the science of what you're proposing, and this is where a lot of the scientific comments were made. But again, the logic of your science really matters here. You still have to write a good grant, right? You can't make fatal flaws about the science you're proposing. You can't do boring science. People have to appreciate the significance of what you're doing. They have to feel like it's worth funding the work, as well as, the investment in you and the strong mentorship that you'll have to advance your own career. So the science always matters. And, you can't have later specific aims that are reliant on finding certain things in the earlier specific aims. All the other rules we learn about grant writing certainly matter in these awards as well. So strong rationale and significance. Mitchell made some great comments about recognizing his own gaps, that he had been doing primarily behavioral work, and that if he was really going to make the biggest impact in understanding what addiction does to the brain, that he might have to move to electrophys in his own independent lab someday. So identifying those gaps as they fit with your long-term vision for yourself as an independent researcher, and then making a plan to go out and get the skills that you will need to achieve that vision. Walk the reviewers through that. Make it clear to them. Make it so they can't misunderstand or forget any of the key things as it relates to your career arc. There needs to be logic. It needs to build on where you've come from, where you are, and where you hope to go. This training potential one was based on the RFA that, again, I kept going back to. This is where I kind of fit the checklist types of items. Did you have balance between the years and the different phases? Did the amount of your grant space make sense given the amount of years you're going to spend in the two different phases? Are the skills of your mentors aligned with the skills you are going to be learning at that step of your career? And I think really importantly, the RFA for NIA specifically asks about identified milestones. And so it's a really easy thing when an RFA says you need to have milestones identified to track your progress. If you don't have milestones in your grant, be ready to get a worse score. So it's mostly about paying attention to the RFA, not about the milestones. Although I think that timelines and milestones are good for any training grant. What are you planning to do? How are you going to demonstrate that you've achieved it? And how can you show reviewers you've really thought through the logical purpose of your training as it fits with your science? And then Mitchell made a comment that he received critiques along the last bullet here. You're learning how to be an independent scientist, and the more you can show additional skills that you'll receive training in outside of the lab, the better. So grant writing, manuscript writing, I think budgeting and financial capacity to run a lab is important too. And a lot of places like UCI have stood up resources on this type of thing. And so leveraging the resources for both phases really makes a lot of sense. I think it, especially if you have a fair amount of time left in your F99 phase, I think it's a great thing to do as a grad student. And people kind of understand that in your K00 phase, you're going to be trying to get that Nature paper and thinking about going on the talk circuit to get a job. But there's nothing wrong with leveraging the local resources in that phase as well. And speaking of local resources, the last thing that you score, aside from all the non-score driving things like human subjects and biosafety, et cetera, the last thing is environment. And it really did matter. Obviously, you guys are all in a great position because UCI does very well in grants like this one as a training environment. There is a wealth of things you can point to as opportunities you can leverage in your training, kind of like GPS Biomed, for example. And you want to take full advantage of those while also being sensitive to that they have to make sense, right? It's not a list. We use them as a list when we're writing training grants, but for you, it needs to be more targeted and tailored to your needs and goals. And you should think about trying to identify the ones that are going to be available to you in your K00 phase as well. And even if you don't know where that place is, you can kind of speak to the theoretical. What things does UCI have that you hope your K00 phase will have, and how will you use them as compared to what you're doing in your F99, right? So you wouldn't want to have the same things in both phases and say, oh, I really like this at UCI in my F99, so I'm hoping to find a place that has it for my K00 as well. Rather, you'd want to think about where your career will be at that phase and the new things you're going to need, and hoping to find a place that might have them. And if you are a addiction researcher like Mitchell, maybe there's like a NIDA funded center that has things like this. And you could say in your strategy for identifying a K00 mentor, then I'm really going to start by scouring these centers because they all have well-funded investigators doing the right kind of work, and they have these other resources. In our world, that might be the Alzheimer's disease research centers, where there are about 30 of those around the country. They all have training resources as well as a variety of types of research. So that might be a network you could tap into. But again, showing that you've thought this through, showing that you've got an idea of what type of place you're going to look to. And the more it's a tier 1 research organization, the better received it'll be. That's just unfortunately the reality of it. Can you go to a place that's not a tier 1 research institution? Absolutely. But hopefully you've identified the mentor at that place, and they've got about 3 or 4 R01s to make up for the lack of other institutional support. Okay, so my order of importance in thinking about hopefully everyone knows that you score each of these things that I've just gone through, and in the end you have to give an overall score, a single number, and every person on the study section is going to score you in an overall score. And in standard research grants, that overall score is largely driven, not exclusively, but largely driven by the approach. Here, I think the main driver of scores is the candidate themselves. The mentors are a close second. If you've got 2 Nobel laureates as your F99 and K00 mentors, you're off to a pretty good start. It's not enough. And I actually gave a really good score to a person who had amazing mentors and I thought exciting science, but other people clearly didn't like the science, gave much worse scores than I did, and the application ended up not discussed. I didn't know enough about that science to fight for it and pull it back into the discussion. But these are the way that study sections go. After that, obviously the training and the science matter a great deal. And then as you move down, the area of study actually is lower on the priority. And the environment, I think is is important, but nowhere near as important as the other things. And then my last slide, and then I'll stop sharing so we can hopefully look at each other and talk about this stuff. Through my 2-day study section, I actually felt like there was an evolution in how people were scoring the grants. And it really stemmed from this mentorship aspect and how you divided your F99 and K00s. And there would be applications that broke these rules, but I was left with a very strong sense that to get the very best score, you had to have a strong F99 situation and mentor and a strong K00 situation and mentor identified with a letter. That's really where the ones were. If you had a strong F99 and you were productive and you knew what you needed and how you were going to go about looking for it for your K00, you were still a very fundable application, but you were a 2 or a 3. Whereas the true, everything was laid out, those were the ones. And then you came down from there, and it could get dicey quickly. You didn't have a good plan for how you were going to identify your K00. Or you had a plan, but reviewers weren't necessarily buying it. Those letters that said, if you graduate and get this grant, we will consider you for a position. Like that, you might have been better off just saying how you're going to look for someone than have weak letters. And so that's where the scores started to dip into the 3, 4, and 5 range. And then it got really dicey. If your plan was not balanced, if you had the same institution for both phases, let alone I reviewed one that had the same mentor for both phases, that was a non-starter. You gotta go get some different skills from some different people. And I think this is actually the most critical thing. You can't get a fundable score unless you've got this sorted out. And the strongest possible path is to have 2 different people identified. A second option is to have a strong mentor now and a good plan for identifying a good mentor for your K00. After that, I think you're tempting fate, and you have a lower probability of getting your